Neighbor cuts down man's tree, pays $1.2 million. Michael's heart raced as he busted through the doors and ran down to them. He was shouting at them to stop. He waved frantically as he tried desperately to get their attention. He was angry as he told him that he never agreed to this. Immediately, the man stopped cutting the tree, dialed a number, and handed him the phone. This was just the beginning. Michael and his wife, Emma, lived in a nice area just outside Nashville, Tennessee. Recently moved, they wanted to make some small changes to the backyard to really make the place their own. As with many houses around the area, their yard was big and was lined with many trees along their property line. In fact, the trees that lined the end of the backyard were one of the reasons they decided to buy the house. They were a beautiful array of colors throughout the year. But there was one tree that seemed to always block the sunset, and so they decided to start looking around for quotes on the cost to chop it down. That's when the trouble started. In fact, the trees that lined the end of the backyard were one of the reasons they decided to buy the house. They were a beautiful array of colors throughout the year. But there was one tree that seemed to always block the sunset, and so they decided to start looking around for quotes on the cost to chop it down. That's when the trouble started. After he showed him around, his neighbor told him he'd work out the numbers and drop the quote in his mailbox later. But he never did. Michael thanked him for his help and told him he appreciated his time as he knew very little about tree cutting costs. The last house he lived in didn't have a garden, so this was all new to him. As what soon followed. It was about a week later when Michael found himself enraged. Shouting at a stranger to stop what he was doing. What on earth was happening? Michael often arrives home before his wife every day. As a lawyer, she works incredibly long hours. So Michael was the first to see the horrific scene unfolding right before his very eyes. A week after Michael's neighbor popped over to provide a quote, he came home to the sound of engines. Confused, he followed the sound to the back of his house and his eyes opened wide. In his yard was a number of large trucks and equipment from his neighbor's tree company. Then he saw what they were doing. They had already started to cut down trees at the end of his backyard. And not just the one they wanted gone. No, they had already cut down a number of their beloved trees. Michael's heart raced as he busted through the doors and ran down to them, shouting at them to stop. He waved frantically as his voice was drowned out by the loud machinery. One worker saw Michael sprinting towards him and immediately shut off his engine. When he understood what he said, he immediately hopped out and waved at his crew to stop what they were doing. Michael looked around at the devastation and angrily asked him what they were doing. He replied that they had been told to chop down these trees by their boss, his neighbor. Michael, intensely confused, told him that he never agreed to any work taking place here. Immediately, the worker rang his boss, Michael's neighbor, and handed him the phone. After a heated, short conversation, they hung up. The workers left his property and Michael was left with huge fallen trees and debris scattered around his yard. This was just the beginning. When Michael's wife came home, she was devastated that her beloved trees were gone. And she hated now being able to see the cars pass on the busy road that hid behind their old trees. The next day, they wanted to sort this out with their neighbor, but there was a problem. The trees that were cut down and left messily on their land had slid onto the busy road after a night of heavy rainfall. They woke up to the cops knocking on their door. They were informed that the trees were their responsibility, so they would need to pay for the expense of the city moving these massive trees. They explained the situation, and with Michael's wife being a lawyer, she was able to calmly and effectively avoid blame and responsibility for this. But that's when things got interesting. Michael's neighbor then arrived and tried to negotiate to pay half of the fees with the couple. Michael and his wife refused to pay anything. After weeks of back and forth and growing annoyance at the loss of their beautiful trees, they ended up hiring a tree doctor to determine the value of the trees they had lost as a way to get their neighbor to admit his wrong and pay up. To the couple's astonishment, their trees were valued at a ridiculously high price as they were rare oak trees that took hundreds of years to grow. They then hired an attorney and equipped him with all the knowledge they gained from the tree doctor and the overhanging bill left by the council to clean up the road. It was then when he told them of how much they could sue his neighbor's company for. Their neighbor's mistake led to a $1.2 million lawsuit to cover all damages created by this incident, including covering attorney fees, road cleanup fees, and the value of the decades-old trees he cut down. The neighbor declared his business bankrupt and shut down his business. He sold his house and moved out of town too. Michael and his wife didn't have to pay a penny.